The Servant and the Shadow. The night she met the Vampire King was the same night she was meant to die, though she did not know it yet, and perhaps that is the strangest part of this entire story. How the universe sometimes moves in ways we cannot understand, bringing two souls together at the exact moment when everything hangs in the balance between life and death, between hope and complete despair. Her name was Elena, and she was nothing more than a servant in the great stone castle that overlooked the village of Ashbrook, a place where the wind always seemed to carry whispers of ancient secrets, and the shadows stretched longer than they should, as if the darkness itself was alive and watching everything that happened within those old walls. Elena had worked in this castle since she was 12 years old, scrubbing floors until her hands cracked and bled, carrying heavy trays up endless staircases, and sleeping in a tiny room beneath the kitchen where the cold seeped through the walls and wrapped around her bones like chains made of ice. She had learned many things in her 19 years of life, and perhaps the most important lesson was this: keep your head down, speak only when spoken to, and never under any circumstances look into the eyes of those who hold power over you. This was not just wisdom passed down from her mother before she died, but a survival technique that had kept Elena alive in a world where servants disappeared without explanation, and no one ever asked questions about where they went. The lord of the castle, a cruel man named Baron Aldric, treated his servants like they were less than the hunting dogs he kept in the kennels, and everyone who worked within those walls understood that their lives meant nothing to him. But on this particular evening, something was different. Something had shifted in the very air of the castle, and Elena could feel it prickling against her skin like the static before a great storm. The other servants had been whispering all day, their voices tight with fear, their eyes darting toward the main hall where preparations were being made for a guest who was arriving at midnight. Elena had heard fragments of their conversations as she worked, words that made no sense to her at first but slowly began to form a picture that filled her stomach with dread. The Vampire King was coming, they said, and Baron Aldric had invited him to discuss a treaty that would bind their two territories together. The Vampire King, whose real name was Lord Kieran Vane, was a creature of legend and nightmare, a being who had lived for over 500 years and ruled over the eastern mountains where no human dared to travel. Stories about him spread through the villages like wildfire, tales of his impossible strength, his eyes that could see into your very soul, and his complete lack of mercy for those who stood against him. Elena tried to push these thoughts from her mind as she carried a tray of polished silver goblets toward the great hall, her worn shoes making soft sounds against the stone floor that seemed impossibly loud in the heavy silence of the castle. She had been ordered to help serve during the midnight meeting, a task that terrified her because it meant she would be in the same room as the Vampire King himself, breathing the same air as a creature who could end her life with a single movement of his hand. But refusing was not an option, and so she walked forward with her heart pounding so hard she could hear the blood rushing through her ears, reminding her that she was alive and fragile and completely at the mercy of beings far more powerful than herself. The great hall was transformed when she entered, lit by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across the ancient tapestries hanging on the walls, and Elena noticed immediately that the Baron had spared no expense in preparing for his guest. The long oak table was covered with a cloth of deep crimson, and golden plates gleamed at each setting like captured pieces of the sun. The Baron himself stood near the enormous fireplace, dressed in his finest clothes, but Elena could see the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides, the way his eyes kept moving toward the main doors as if expecting something terrible to burst through them at any moment. Even the powerful Baron Aldric, a man who had never shown fear in front of his servants, was afraid of what was coming. The clock struck midnight with 12 long chimes that echoed through the hall like the tolling of funeral bells, and on the final note, the doors swung open without anyone touching them, revealing a figure that made Elena forget how to breathe. The Vampire King entered with the silent grace of a predator, his footsteps making no sound on the stone floor, his presence filling the entire room with an energy that pressed against Elena's skin like physical weight. He was tall, far taller than any man she had ever seen, with hair as black as a moonless night that fell past his shoulders in waves that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. His face was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, all sharp angles and perfect symmetry, but it was his eyes that captured Elena and held her frozen in place, eyes that were the color of liquid silver and held depths of knowledge and pain that spanned centuries. Elena lowered her gaze immediately, remembering her training, remembering that looking into the eyes of the powerful was a death sentence, but something strange happened in that brief moment of connection. A feeling passed through her like lightning but gentler, like recognition of something she could not name, and she knew with absolute certainty that the Vampire King had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that no one had ever done before. She busied herself with arranging the goblets on the table, her hands shaking so badly that the silver rattled together, and she prayed desperately that no one would notice her, that she could remain invisible until this terrifying night was over. The meeting between Baron Aldric and Lord Kieran began with formal words and negotiations that Elena did not understand, discussions of borders and treaties and mutual protection against enemies whose names meant nothing to her. She moved around the edges of the room like a ghost, refilling wine glasses and removing empty plates, always keeping her eyes on the floor and her movements as quiet as possible. But even as she worked, she could feel something watching her, a gaze that followed her wherever she went, and she knew without looking that the Vampire King's silver eyes had found her again and again throughout the evening. Everything changed in a single moment, and that moment came when Baron Aldric reached across the table and grabbed Elena's wrist with brutal force, dragging her forward because she had accidentally spilled a single drop of wine on the crimson tablecloth. The pain was sharp and immediate as his fingers dug into her flesh, and Elena cried out before she could stop herself, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. The Baron's face twisted with rage as he raised his other hand to strike her, his eyes blazing with the cruelty she had seen so many times before, and Elena closed her eyes and waited for the blow that would surely knock her to the ground. But the blow never came, and when Elena opened her eyes again, she saw something that would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. The Vampire King was standing between her and the Baron, his hand wrapped around Aldric's wrist with the same grip the Baron had used on her, and the expression on Lord Kieran's face was one of cold, terrifying fury. The temperature in the room had dropped so suddenly that Elena could see her breath misting in the air, and the candles flickered wildly as if responding to the anger radiating from the Vampire King in waves. What followed happened so quickly that Elena could barely process it, the Baron releasing her and stumbling backward with fear in his eyes, the Vampire King speaking words in a language she did not understand but which seemed to make the very walls tremble with their power. When Lord Kieran turned to face her, Elena expected death, expected punishment for causing such a disruption, expected anything except what actually happened. The Vampire King took her hand gently in his touch surprisingly warm for a creature of the night, and slowly, deliberately, he raised it to his lips and pressed a kiss against her trembling fingers. The room fell into absolute silence as every person present held their breath, and Elena felt something change within her in that moment, something ancient and powerful awakening in her blood like fire spreading through dry wood. The Vampire King's silver eyes met hers, and this time she did not look away, could not look away, and she saw in their depths a message meant only for her. "You are not what you think you are," those eyes seemed to say, "and before this night is over, you will understand why I have been searching for you for 500 years. Baron Aldric's voice broke the spell, harsh and demanding, asking the Vampire King what he was doing and why he had touched a worthless servant, but Lord Kieran simply smiled, a slow and dangerous expression that held no warmth whatsoever. He released Elena's hand and turned back to the Baron, and when he spoke, his words echoed through the hall with an authority that made Elena's knees weak. "This meeting is over," he said, "and I am taking this woman with me when I leave, and if you try to stop me, I will burn your castle to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." Elena stood frozen as chaos erupted around her, servants screaming and running, the Baron shouting protests that died in his throat when the Vampire King's eyes flashed with a light that was not quite human. She did not understand what was happening or why the most powerful creature in the known world had just claimed her, a simple servant with nothing to offer, a girl who had never been worth anything to anyone. But as Lord Kieran turned back to her and extended his hand in invitation, Elena knew that her old life was over and something new and terrifying and wonderful was about to begin. She did not know that at that very moment, assassins were approaching the castle from all directions, hired by enemies who wanted both the vampire king and Baron Aldric dead before dawn. She did not know that the kiss on her hand had activated something in her blood that had been dormant for generations, a power that made her one of the most valuable and dangerous creatures in existence. And she certainly did not know that the vampire king had not chosen her at random, but had been following signs and prophecies that led him to this exact moment in time, to a servant girl with fire in her soul and the blood of ancient warriors running through her veins. As Elena placed her trembling hand in the vampire king's palm and allowed him to lead her toward the castle doors, she looked back one final time at the only home she had ever known, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. Baron Aldric was smiling, a terrible smile that did not match the fear he had shown moments before, and in his eyes she saw the glint of triumph that made no sense unless he had planned this entire evening from the very beginning. The castle doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, and Elena stepped into a night that would test everything she thought she knew about herself, about power, and about the thin line between love and destruction. A blood and secrets. The journey through the dark forest that surrounded Baron Aldric's castle was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced, and she found herself struggling to keep up with the Vampire King's long strides even though he appeared to be walking at a leisurely pace. The moon hung heavy and full above them, casting silver light through the twisted branches of ancient trees that seemed to lean toward them as they passed, their shadows reaching like grasping fingers across the narrow path. Elena had never been outside the castle grounds at night before, had never felt the weight of true darkness pressing against her from all sides, and every sound in the forest made her heart leap with terror, even though she was walking beside the most powerful predator in the land. Lord Kieran had not spoken a single word since they left the castle, his face an unreadable mask of sharp angles and shadows that seemed to shift with each flicker of moonlight. Elena wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, wanted to demand to know why he had taken her and what the kiss on her hand had meant and where they were going, but the words died in her throat every time she looked at him. This was a creature who had lived for 500 years, who had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon the shore, and what was she compared to that endless experience? She was nothing more than a servant girl with calloused hands and a heart full of fear, and she could not imagine any reason why such a being would want anything to do with her. They had been walking for perhaps an hour when the Vampire King suddenly stopped, his entire body going still in a way that made Elena think of the hunting cats she had seen in the Baron's menagerie, predators who froze the moment they sensed prey nearby. Elena opened her mouth to ask what was wrong, but before she could speak, Lord Kieran's hand was over her lips, gentle but firm, and his silver eyes were scanning the darkness around them with an intensity that made her breath catch in her chest. "Stay behind me and do not move no matter what happens," he whispered, his voice so low it was barely more than a breath against her ear. And then he was gone, vanishing into the shadows between the trees with a speed that was impossible for any human to match. For a long moment, Elena stood alone in the dark forest, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain anything hunting them would find her by the sound alone. The silence pressed against her from all sides, thick and suffocating, and she strained her ears for any hint of what was happening beyond the range of her vision. Then the screaming started, terrible sounds of pain and fear that cut through the night like blades, and Elena had to clamp her own hands over her mouth to keep from crying out in response. She did not know how many people were dying in the darkness around her, did not know who had come to attack them or why, but the sounds told her everything she needed to know about the violence of the battle. When Lord Kieran finally emerged from the shadows, his elegant clothes were spattered with blood that looked black in the moonlight, and his silver eyes glowed with an inner light that made Elena take an instinctive step backward. He stopped a few feet away from her, and she watched as the glow slowly faded from his eyes, as the predator who had slaughtered their attackers retreated and something more controlled took its place. "Assassins," he said simply, as if reporting on the weather rather than the lives he had just ended, and they carried the seal of the Black Serpent Guild on their weapons. She did not know what the Black Serpent Guild was, but she understood from his tone that this was significant, that someone had paid a great deal of money to have them both killed before they reached their destination. The rest of the journey passed in tense silence, and Elena noticed that Lord Kieran stayed much closer to her than before, his body angled to put himself between her and the surrounding darkness at all times. They did not speak of the attack, did not discuss the blood that was slowly drying on his clothes, but something had shifted between them in the aftermath of that violence. Elena had seen the vampire king in his truest form, had witnessed the deadly grace with which he dispatched their enemies, and yet she found that her fear of him was fading rather than growing. He had protected her, had placed himself between her and death without hesitation, and that meant something even if she did not fully understand what. Dawn was approaching when they finally emerged from the forest onto a cliff that overlooked a valley Elena had never seen before, and what she saw there made her forget everything else in a moment of pure wonder. A castle rose from the valley floor, but it was unlike any structure she had ever imagined, its towers spiraling toward the sky like frozen flames and its walls gleaming with a dark iridescence that shifted colors as she watched. Lights burned in hundreds of windows, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and even from this distance she could feel the power emanating from the ancient stones. "Welcome to Ravenhold," Lord Kieran said quietly, standing beside her on the cliff's edge, "and welcome to your new home, Elena." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she turned to face him with confusion written across her features, her mind racing to understand what he meant by calling this magnificent place her home. She was a servant, she reminded herself, a girl who had scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots for as long as she could remember, and girls like her did not live in castles made of shadows and starlight. But before she could voice her protests, Lord Kieran was speaking again, and what he told her changed everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in this world. "You are not what Baron Aldric told you," he began, his silver eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "And the woman who raised you was not your mother, but a servant who was paid to keep you hidden until the time was right." Elena shook her head in denial, not wanting to believe him, but he continued without pause. 20 years ago, there was a woman named Elena Vane, my sister, and she was the most powerful seer our bloodline had produced in 300 years. She saw things in her visions that terrified the other vampire lords, prophecies of change and upheaval that threatened their power, and so they conspired together to have her killed before her visions could come true. Elena's legs felt weak beneath her, and she sank to the ground on the cliff's edge, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Lord Kieran knelt beside her, his movements graceful even in this gesture of comfort, and his voice became softer as he continued. "My sister knew they were coming for her, and she knew that her death was unavoidable, but she also knew that she was carrying a child, a daughter who would inherit her powers and more. The night before the assassins came, Elena hid her daughter with a trusted servant and sent them to the farthest corner of the human kingdoms, begging them to keep the child safe until I could find her. That child was you, Elena, and you are not a servant at all but the heir to the Vane bloodline and my niece by blood." The revelation crashed over Elena like a wave, and she found herself gasping for air as tears streamed down her face without her permission. She thought of the woman she had called mother, the one who had died of fever when Elena was 8 years old, and now she understood the strange sadness that had always lived in that woman's eyes. She thought of Baron Aldric and the cruel way he had treated her, and she wondered with growing horror if he had known her true identity all along. The pieces were falling into place in her mind, forming a picture that was too overwhelming to fully comprehend. "Baron Aldric knew," she said suddenly, the words coming to her with terrible clarity as she remembered the smile on his face when Lord Kieran had led her from the castle. "He wanted you to find me and take me away, and he had something planned, something that required us to be together outside his walls." Lord Kieran's expression darkened with understanding, and he nodded slowly, confirming her worst fears. The assassins were not random, Elena realized. They were the first wave of whatever trap the Baron had set, and more would be coming. They rose together from the cliff's edge, and Elena looked down at her hands, the same hands that had scrubbed countless floors and carried countless trays, and she tried to imagine the power that Lord Kieran claimed ran through her veins. She did not feel special, did not feel like an heir to anything, but she had seen the kiss on her hand and felt the fire it had awakened, and she knew that denying the truth would not make it go away. Whatever she was, whatever destiny awaited her, she would have to face it with the same resilience that had allowed her to survive 19 years of servitude and abuse. The journey down into the valley took longer than Elena expected, and by the time they reached the gates of Ravenhold, the sun had fully risen over the distant mountains. She expected Lord Kieran to suffer in the sunlight, having heard stories of vampires burning when exposed to the day, but he walked beside her without apparent discomfort, and when she asked about it, he laughed for the first time since she had met him. Human stories, he explained with amusement in his voice, are mostly nonsense designed to make people feel safer in the dark. And while sunlight does weaken our kind, it will not kill us unless we are already injured or very old. The gates opened at their approach, and Elena stepped into a world that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, a world of vampires and magic and power that she had never known existed. Servants rushed to greet them, but they were not subservient and cowering like the servants in Baron Aldric's castle. They moved with pride and purpose, and they looked at Elena with curiosity rather than disdain. Lord Kieran led her through corridors lined with portraits of vampires who had lived and died over the centuries, and Elena found herself searching their faces for any resemblance to her own, any proof of the connection he claimed they shared. They finally stopped before a door that seemed older than the rest of the castle, its wood carved with symbols that glowed faintly in the torchlight. "This was your mother's room," Lord Kieran said quietly, "and no one has entered it since the night she left to hide you." He pressed his palm against the door, and the symbols flared with brilliant light before the door swung open on silent hinges. Inside, Elena saw a room frozen in time, books still open on the desk, clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, and a portrait hanging over the fireplace that made her heart stop in her chest. The woman in the portrait had Elena's face, her exact features reflected in paint and canvas, and even the expression in her eyes was familiar because Elena had seen it in her own reflection 1,000 times. She walked toward the portrait as if in a trance, her hand reaching out to touch the frame, and when her fingers made contact with the wood, a voice spoke in her mind with terrible urgency. "Daughter," the voice said, and Elena knew somehow that it was her mother speaking from beyond death itself. "The moment you touch this portrait, the beacon will activate and every enemy we ever made will know where you are. You must run, my child, and you must not trust anyone, not even Kieran, because there is a traitor in his court who has been waiting for this moment for 20 years. Elena's blood ran cold as she spun to face Lord Kieran, but before she could speak, before she could warn him, the windows of the chamber exploded inward and armed figures poured through them like a river of steel and death. Elena screamed as hands grabbed her from behind, as something sharp pressed against her throat, and the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Lord Kieran fighting against a dozen attackers, blood streaming from wounds that appeared faster than they could heal, and his silver eyes filled with desperate fear not for himself but for her. When she woke, she was in a dungeon she did not recognize, and the face hovering above her was one she knew better than any other because it belonged to Baron Aldric himself, smiling his terrible smile as he whispered words that shattered what remained of her hope. "Welcome home, niece," he said with poison in his voice, "and thank you for leading me straight to the Vampire King so that I could finally destroy him and claim his throne for myself." Fire and fate. The dungeon where Elena woke was cold and dark and smelled of things she did not want to name, and the chains around her wrists were heavy enough that she could barely lift her arms from the stone floor. Baron Aldric's face swam in and out of focus above her, his terrible smile the only clear thing in a world that seemed to be made entirely of shadows and pain, and she struggled to remember how she had ended up here, in the depths of what she could only assume was some fortress far from Lord Kieran's castle of Ravenhold. The memories came back slowly, each one bringing a new wave of despair. The voice of her dead mother warning her of a traitor, the windows exploding, the hands grabbing her, and worst of all, the image of Lord Kieran fighting against impossible odds while she was dragged away from him. Baron Aldric seemed to enjoy her suffering, crouching beside her with his elbows on his knees like a parent speaking to a young child, and his voice when he spoke was soft and almost gentle, which somehow made his words even more terrifying. You have no idea, he said with something approaching affection, how long I have been planning this moment, how many years I spent searching for you after your mother's servant escaped with you into the night. Elena's mind raced as she tried to understand, tried to put together the pieces of a puzzle that suddenly seemed much larger than she had imagined. Baron Aldric continued speaking, seemingly delighted to finally have an audience for his revelations. Your mother was not killed by a conspiracy of vampire lords, little niece. She was killed by me, because she saw in one of her visions that I would someday rule over both humans and vampires as the greatest king this world has ever known, and she threatened to expose me before my plans could come to fruition. The truth hit Elena like a physical blow, and she understood now why she had been treated so cruelly in Baron Aldric's castle, why she had been kept alive instead of simply killed as an infant. You needed me, she said through cracked and bleeding lips, because something about me was necessary for your plans, something you could not achieve on your own. The Baron's smile widened with genuine pleasure at her intelligence, and he nodded slowly, reaching out to brush a strand of dirty hair from her face with surprising gentleness. Your blood, he explained as if teaching a lesson, carries the power of the Vane bloodline, a power that can only be accessed by one of their own descendants. And with that power, I will be able to create an army of creatures that will make the vampire lords look like frightened children. Elena closed her eyes against the horror of his words, trying to imagine what kind of creatures he planned to create, what nightmares he intended to unleash upon the world using the power that ran through her veins. She thought of Lord Kieran, who had kissed her hand and called her family, who had protected her from assassins in the forest and brought her to a home she had never known existed, and she felt tears burning behind her closed eyelids. Is he dead? She asked, not wanting to hear the answer but needing to know, and Baron Aldric laughed with the sound of breaking glass. Not yet, he admitted with obvious disappointment, because your uncle proved to be more difficult to kill than I anticipated, and my soldiers were only able to wound him before his guards arrived to drive them back. But he is trapped in his own castle, surrounded by my forces, and it is only a matter of time before he falls and I can claim everything he built. Elena felt a tiny spark of hope ignite in her chest at these words, hope that she immediately tried to extinguish because false hope was more dangerous than no hope at all. But the spark refused to die, growing warmer as she remembered something her mother's voice had said in that final warning. There is a traitor in his court who has been waiting for this moment for 20 years. She had assumed the traitor was someone close to Lord Kieran, someone who had allowed the attackers into the castle, but now she wondered if she had misunderstood the warning entirely. Her mother had said not to trust anyone, not even Kieran, and at the time Elena had thought this meant her uncle might be the traitor himself. But what if the warning was more specific? What if her mother was trying to tell her that the traitor was someone who had been waiting in Lord Kieran's court but was actually working for Baron Aldric all along? Elena's mind raced through the faces she had seen at Ravenhold, the servants who had greeted them at the gate, and she remembered one face in particular, a vampire with red hair and a smile that had seemed just slightly too eager, too curious about the newcomer who had arrived with their king. Baron Aldric left her alone in the dungeon after his revelations, confident that she was too weak and too well guarded to pose any threat to his plans, and Elena used the hours of solitude to gather her strength and think about everything she had learned. She thought about her mother, Elena Vane, who had sacrificed everything to keep her daughter safe from a monster wearing human skin. She thought about the power that supposedly ran through her blood, the inheritance of seers and warriors that she had never known existed. And most importantly, she thought about the fire she had felt when Lord Kieran kissed her hand, the awakening of something ancient and powerful that had been sleeping inside her for 19 years. If she truly was the daughter of a powerful seer, if she truly carried the blood of the Vane lineage, then perhaps she had more strength than Baron Aldric realized. Elena closed her eyes and reached inward, searching for that fire, that spark of power that had responded to her uncle's touch, and to her amazement she found it waiting for her, burning low but steady like an ember that had never quite gone out. She fed it with her anger, her grief, her desperate need to protect the only family she had left, and she felt it grow stronger, felt it spreading through her veins like liquid light. The chains around her wrists began to glow with heat, and Elena watched in wonder as the metal softened and dripped away like water, leaving her hands free and burning with power she had never imagined possessing. Guards burst through the dungeon door at the sound of the chains falling, but Elena was already moving, and the fire that erupted from her palms caught them before they could reach her, sending them screaming to the ground as flames consumed their armor and flesh. She did not stop to think about what she was doing, did not allow herself to feel horror at the violence she was capable of, because there would be time for such feelings later, after she had escaped, after she had saved her uncle, after she had made Baron Aldric pay for everything he had done. The fortress was a maze of corridors and staircases, but Elena followed her instincts, trusting the power that was now fully awake inside her to guide her toward freedom. Guards tried to stop her at every turn, but her fire was stronger than their weapons, and she burned through their defenses like the sun burning through morning mist. She did not know how long she ran, did not know how many enemies fell before her, but eventually she burst through a door and found herself standing on a battlement high above a moonlit valley, breathing air that tasted like freedom and blood. Below her, she could see Baron Aldric's army spreading across the landscape like a dark tide, thousands of soldiers marching toward a distant point of light that she knew with bone-deep certainty was Ravenhold. Lord Kieran's castle was under siege, and unless she found a way to warn him, unless she found a way to reach him before the Baron's forces broke through his defenses, everything would be lost. Elena looked down at her hands, still glowing with the power of her bloodline, and she made a decision that would either save everything or destroy her completely. She had never tried to fly, had never even imagined that such a thing was possible, but her mother had been a seer and her uncle was a vampire king, and if their blood truly ran through her veins, then perhaps the limits she had always believed in were nothing more than lies she had been taught. Elena closed her eyes, gathered her power around her like a cloak made of flame and starlight, and stepped off the edge of the battlement into the empty air. For one terrible moment she fell, wind screaming past her ears and the ground rushing up to meet her. But then the fire responded to her desperate need and erupted from her back in two great wings of pure light that caught the air and lifted her upward with a force that left her gasping. She was flying, actually flying, soaring over the army below like a comet streaking across the night sky, and the soldiers who looked up at her cried out in fear and wonder at the sight of a creature they had never seen before and could not understand. Elena reached Ravenhold before the army could breach its walls, landing on the highest tower in an explosion of light that drew every eye in the castle upward. Lord Kieran was there waiting for her, wounded but alive, his silver eyes filled with tears that vampires were not supposed to be able to shed. He caught her in his arms when her legs gave out beneath her, held her close with a tenderness that spoke of centuries of loneliness finally ending, and whispered words of gratitude and love that she would remember for the rest of her very long life. The battle that followed was fierce and terrible, but Elena and Lord Kieran fought side by side, fire and shadow working together to push back the darkness that threatened to consume everything they loved. Baron Aldric died screaming when Elena's flames finally found him, and she felt no guilt as she watched the man who had killed her mother and tormented her for 19 years crumble to ash in front of her eyes. The traitor in Lord Kieran's court was exposed and brought to justice, and the vampire lords who had conspired with Baron Aldric were given a choice between bending the knee to the vain bloodline or meeting the same fate as their fallen ally. In the months that followed, Elena learned to control her power, to understand the visions that sometimes came to her in dreams, and to accept the destiny that had been waiting for her since before she was born. She was no longer a servant scrubbing floors in a cruel man's castle. She was Elena Vane, Princess of Ravenhold, daughter of the greatest seer her people had ever known, and niece of the vampire king who had searched for her for 20 years. But more than any title or power, she was something she had never dared to be before. She was loved, truly and completely loved, by a family she had never known she had. On the 1-year anniversary of the night Lord Kieran had kissed her hand in Baron Aldric's great hall, Elena stood on the same cliff where she had first seen Ravenhold, watching the sun set over a kingdom that was finally at peace. Her uncle stood beside her, healed now from his wounds and looking younger than she had ever seen him, and between them they held the hope of a new era, a time when humans and vampires might learn to live together in something other than fear and violence. The wind carried the scent of flowers from the valley below, and Elena smiled as she remembered the servant girl she had once been, the girl who had believed she was worth nothing and destined for nothing. That girl was gone now, transformed by fire and love into something stronger and brighter than she had ever imagined possible. The Vampire King had kissed her hand, and her life had changed forever. But the most important change had not come from his power or her bloodline or the destiny written in the stars. The most important change had come from within herself, from the resilience and kindness that had allowed her to survive 19 years of darkness and emerge into the light with her soul intact. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Elena turned to face the future with her head held high and her heart full of hope, ready for whatever adventures awaited her in the endless years to come.